passage and ultimately to conference with the House. Let's show that we mean it when we say that we're committed to full and open debate and returning to the process that used to serve us well. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President.
The Senator from Washington.
Madam President, I want to echo what my good friend and partner on this bill, Senator Collins, just said. Like all of us, when I go home to my home state of Washington, I don't hear a lot from my constituents about partisan politics. They don't ask me which party's up or which party's down. They don't care about the political games and certainly not who's winning or losing them. The vast majority of people I talk to when I go home ask me what we are doing here in Congress to create jobs and get this economy going again. They ask me what we are doing to break through this gridlock and the constant manufactured crisis and make sure that this country, this economy is working for them and their families. They tell me that they want Democrats and Republicans working together. They want us to get into a room and put politics aside and put our country first and find some common ground and get something done. Madam President, that kind of work is far too rare these days, though many of us are fighting to change that. I'm very proud that the transportation bill that we are about to vote on today does just that. This bill isn't exactly what I would have written had I done it on my own or what Senator Collins would have done on her own.
Senator's time has expired.
I ask for 30 seconds. Additional seconds.
Without objection.
This is a bill that is a compromise that reflects the deep cuts we set in the spending levels of the Budget Control Act. It reflects the best ideas of both sides. So I urge my colleagues to move past the obstruction, get over the gridlock. Let's show the American people we can work for them. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The Republican leader.
I want to commend the senior senator from Maine for the extraordinary amount of work she and her staff have put into this bill. But regretfully, where we are is cloture on this transportation bill will be viewed as a question of whether or not we intend to keep the commitment we made to the American people 2 years ago this month to reduce $2.1 trillion in spending over the next 10 years. The House of Representatives is marking to a $91 billion a year lower figure, which reflects the law. And I believe that if we invoke cloture on this bill and move forward, it will be widely viewed throughout the country that we are walking away from a commitment we made on a bipartisan basis that the President signed just 2 years ago, that we would reduce spending by this amount of money, $2.1 trillion over the next 10 years. So regretfully, I would strongly urge my colleagues to keep the bipartisan commitment we made 2 years ago and to vote no on cloture on this bill. I yield the floor.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on S-1243, a bill making appropriations for the Departments of Transportation and Housing and Urban Development and related agencies for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2014, and for other purposes, signed by 18 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on S-1243, an original bill making appropriations for the Departments of Transportation and Housing and Urban Development and related agencies for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2014, and for other purposes, shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Yes, sir. Sir.
He's coming over to his spot.
Thanks.
You got to
Gotcha. Ms. Ayotte. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Sir. 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 White House. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Sir. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chiesa. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Kimmy. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Sir. Thank you. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. I did. Mr. King.
I was waiting the first time.
If you're going to be
Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado.
You got me, right? You got me.
Yes, sir, I did. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter. Yeah, I have you. Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Begich, Bennett, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Collins, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Harkin, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Manchin, Markey, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murray, Nelson, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Johnson. Sir. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin. Aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich. Aye. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Hatch, Heller, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kirk, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, and Wicker. Mr. Leahy, aye. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Hoeven. Mr. Hoeven, no. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, no. Ms. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mrs. Hagan. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Chiesa. Mr. Chiesa, no. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, No. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham. No.
Right. Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote? Any senators in the chamber wishing to change their vote? On this vote, the yeas are 54, the nays are 43. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative. The motion is not agreed to. Under the previous order, the Senate stands in recess until 2 p.m.
And the Senate has recessed for a joint caucus meeting. That's a barbecue today for both Democrats and Republicans. Senators coming back in about an hour at 2 Eastern to debate the nomination of Samantha Power for U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. That vote should be about 4 o'clock. Let's take you live now back to Capitol Hill. Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid